Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. In this lesson, I want to get back into the Visual Basic syntax itself, and I want to talk about declaring variables, choosing a data type for your variable, and then initializing variables. So to begin with, as you can see in Notepad on screen, I have a little algebra problem that I want to throw at you. And even if you've taken an introduction to algebra, you should be able to solve this one pretty easily, right? So here I just want to solve for the value of x. So without a whole lot of thought, hopefully you can take a look and see that, well, the value of x must be 7, right? So using that same thought process now, take a look at this Visual Basic code. All right, so x equals 7, y equals x plus 3. Console.writeLine y. What do you think will be displayed in the console window when we execute this Visual Basic code? Well, probably the value 10, right? So you just read Visual Basic without any help from me. It's pretty common sense, right? I mean, it for the most part makes sense what you're trying to accomplish once you understand, for example, console.writeLine. So first, as far as Visual Basic is concerned, the x and the y in this situation are referred to as variables. And so a variable is simply a bucket in your computer's memory that's capable of holding a value. So you can put values into buckets, or rather into variables. You can take values out of variables, or the buckets, all right? And then suppose I put something in the bucket, I can put something else in the bucket and cover up or eliminate the original value, and now it has something new in that bucket in the computer's memory, that variable, all right? So this particular case has these buckets just holding numeric values, but we could create buckets that are just the right size to hold any kind of data. So for example, we can create a bucket that's just the right size, a variable in the computer's memory that's just the right size for strings of individual characters, so strings, very big numbers, very small numbers, true, false, dates and times, and numbers that have values after the decimal place, and a lot more. So there's a lot of different kinds of data types that are available in Visual Basic. And so in the case of this little code snippet that you see on screen right now, we would expect that both x and y to hold numeric values. Now, these particular numeric values probably don't have any values after the decimal point, so that narrows down the kind of data or the data type that we would choose to store values for this particular application. Now, we know that x and y should store numeric values, but we have to express that intent using the Visual Basic programming language so that when our code is compiled, it can be executed and carry out the instructions that we have in our mind. So the instructions that we give in Visual Basic will ultimately be executed by, remember that .NET runtime, what I call the Common Language Runtime, or just the CLR. And part of its responsibilities is to allocate space, buckets, in the computer's memory sufficiently large enough to hold the variables that we declare, to hold data, and we tell it what kind of data, the size of the bucket, in other words, that we want to create in the computer's memory. So in this case, we're going to have two data items, x and y, and we have to tell the runtime using Visual Basic Code to allocate some space, enough space in memory, sufficiently large enough to hold numeric data sufficient for our application. So how do we do that? Well, we do that by declaring variables. So let me go ahead and get rid of this, and I'm going to create a new project. There's a number of different ways to create projects. We already did file new project, right? But here on the start page, there's also this little link that we can use, new project. Either way, it's going to pop open this new project dialog. So what I'm going to do is call this project variables, all right? And kind of the same rules apply that we talked about before, making sure that we don't make any other changes and just click the OK button. Now, the big takeaway from this lesson is that a variable is simply a bucket in the computer's memory that you can store data inside of, and then you can retrieve data out of it, and that you have to create the right kind of variable using a data type. We have to say what kind of data, what data type we intend to store inside of that variable that we declare. So all the same rules apply here that we talked about in the very first lesson. First of all, you have to type the code in exactly the way that I type it in. If you don't, you're going to get some kind of error. Work through the errors. Make sure you pay attention to detail. If you have to, pause the video, rewind it. Look at the source code that I wrote, because I'm going to supply that to you in zip files. You can unzip it, look at it, compare what I wrote versus what you wrote. But by all means, write this code yourself and start building that muscle memory as you're typing code yourself. If you do run into problems, remember, Visual Studio doesn't leave you hanging. You'll see the little red squiggly lines. You'll see the list of errors as you attempt to start or run the application. Those will all give you hints and clues as to where to look for the problem, and then just start developing that sense of being able to identify visually where the problems are in your code. You got to pay attention to the minutia, spelling, punctuation, everything that fortunately, people like you and I can understand, even if it's not spelled correctly or punctuated correctly. Unfortunately, computers need things exact. Okay, so, and while Visual Basic is forgiving, as we said, you still have to give it the correct instructions. All right, so what we want to do is write 2 lines of code where we're going to declare 2 variables. We're going to say create 2 buckets in the computer's memory that are sufficiently large enough to hold numeric values. And the way we do that here inside of our submain is to use a dim, and that is shortened for dimension, or we often call it declaring variables. Okay, so we're going to give it a name. That is the name of our variable X. We can give it any name with some exceptions. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now we got to say what kind of variable we want to create, and we're going to create a data type called integer. We'll talk about that in a minute too. So I'm going to do the same thing with Y as integer. All right. Now, to borrow from the explanation earlier in the lesson, we're officially asking the .NET runtime to allocate space in the computer's memory sufficiently large enough to hold 2 numeric values. One that we're going to label X so we can get back to it, to save new values in it, or to retrieve the values that are already inside of it. And Y, another label for a different bucket, a different space in the computer's memory, so they will hold 2 different values potentially. All right. So we're asking it to create these 2 buckets that will each hold values that eventually we're going to drop into those variables or drop into those buckets. And then after we've created those buckets or those variables, then we can begin to assign values into the variables and then retrieve values out of the variables. All right. So most importantly, we're going to assign integer values into those variables. How do I know that they're integer values? Well, again, here we use the key word integer in lines number 5 and 6. So integer is the Visual Basic term for a mathematical term, really. It refers to a number that has no fractions or values after a decimal place. It can contain very large numbers from 2,147,000,000 and something odd numbers to a negative 2,147,000,000 and something odd. Okay, so if you need to store a number that's larger than 2,147,000,000, then you want to create a different bucket in the computer's memory because you're going to need a larger bucket to hold larger numbers. Conversely, you probably want to use a smaller bucket if you really don't plan on using very many values inside of it. So for example, a true false value, you need a real tiny bucket because it only needs to store a 0 or a 1, which is true or false. Okay. So at any rate, like I indicated earlier, there are many different types of data types. There are simple data types, and then you'll also learn about complex data types. And then later on in this series of lessons, you're going to learn how to create your own custom data types using classes. All right. So because I don't want you to be overwhelmed just yet, I'm going to keep it simple for the moment. We're just going to talk about the integer data type here at the outset. We'll also talk about the string data type in this lesson a little bit later. All right. So first of all, I'm going to assign a value to X I'm going to give it the value 7. Then I'm going to assign a value to y. And we'll take whatever the value of x is and add 3 to it. Now what I want to do is write out the value, console.writeLine, the value of y. And then, of course, we're going to use console.readLine so that we can actually see what it is that we typed in. Okay, let's run the application briefly. And we already know what the answer should be. The answer should be 10, right? Based on the little notepad equation that we saw earlier. We essentially just recreated this, but using actual Visual Basic code in order to come up with the value 10. So what really was going on here? Well, after we've created 2 buckets, 2 variables in the computer's memory, sufficiently large enough to hold integer values, then we started assigning values or putting values in those buckets and retrieving values out of the buckets. So in this first case, in line number 8, you can see that I am putting the value of 7 inside of the bucket labeled X. Then I'm going to retrieve that value out of the bucket labeled X and say, what did I stick in there? Oh yeah, the value 7. We're going to add those 2 values together and then assign that value to y. So at this point now, y should equal 10. Then we're just going to merely do what we've seen before. And instead of hard coding, the value of 10 as a literal string of 2 characters, 1 and 0, we're just going to give the console.writeLine our integer value of y, storing the value of 10, and it will figure out how to print that to screen. And that's how we saw the number 10 show up in our console window, okay? So I think one of the most important things that I didn't cover just yet is the role of this equal sign. It's actually an assignment operator. So in English, that line of code is basically saying set the integer named x equal to the value of 7. All right, and so we do the same thing in the next line of code. We're assigning this value into this variable. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. What I want to do now is comment out all these lines of code, and I can just go through here and one by one use the little single the single quote mark in order to comment all of these lines out. Or I tell you what, I'm going to show you a shortcut. There's a tool here on the toolbar that allow me to do the same thing. So I'm just going to select all the lines of code with my mouse, and then I'm going to choose this little comment out the selected lines. Now notice that I can also use this keyboard combination. If I hit Control K, Control C, that's called a chord in Visual Studio. When you do it's like creating a chord on the piano, and it will also comment all the lines out. But I'm just going to click the button here on. You can see that it added a single tick mark to every line of code, thus commenting out the work that we've just done. I'll leave it here for your reference, all right? Now, I'm going to create a few empty lines here by just hitting Enter on the keyboard a couple of times. And now let's create another example. Here what I'll do is we're going to go console.writeLine, open and closing double quotes, what is your name? Question mark. On the next line, we'll go console.write. Notice I'm not going to use write line. We'll talk about the difference between the two here in a moment. Console.write. And then I'm going to use double quotes inside of that and say, type your first name, colon, space inside of the double quote. The next line of code, I'm going to create a bucket, or rather a variable called lowercase my, capital F, and first, capital N in name as string. Okay, so let's talk about what I did here. Instead of using just a single letter as my variable name, I'm able to use a very long variable name. Furthermore, I'm able to use lowercase letters and capitalized letters in order to kind of give me a visual cue of where one word ends and another word starts. All right, and this is called camel casing. We'll talk about it in just a moment. And instead of creating an integer value, this time I want to capture from the user their name. Their name's not going to be stored in a bucket that can hold integer values, right? We're going to need to store strings of characters so that it can store Bob, B-O-B, okay? So that's what my goal here is, to retrieve the name of the user into this variable called my first name. And the way that I'm going to do that is through the use of the read line. And so we're going to use the read line in a slightly different way than we had before. So my first name equals console.readLine, okay? I'll explain what that does in just a moment. Make some more room, and then we're going to go console.writeLine, open and close double quotes, type your last name, and here actually I don't want to do write line, I'm just going to do write. We'll go dim my capital L last, capital N name as string, my last name equals console.readLine, and then finally console.writeLine. And here, this is going to look crazy. I'm going to do hello, comma, I'm going to use an ampersand character, my first name, another ampersand, that's under the 7 key or over the 7 key on your keyboard. And now I'm going to use an opening and closing double quote, but I'm going to put a space in between the two of them, all right? And this is just going to provide some spacing between the first name and the last name, like so. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here at the very top of this and explain what this is going to do. First of all, what we're going to do is ask the person for the first name. When they type in their first name and hit the enter key on the keyboard, then we're going to retrieve that value and stick it into a variable called my first name. We'll do the same thing with last name by creating a different variable, reading off the value and putting it into the value of the variable. And then we're going to do console.writeLine, and we're going to concatenate or append together my first name, my last name, and this literal string, hello, comma, space, using this ampersand character, which is the string concatenation operator in Visual Basic. It just means that you'll just tie together all of these individual strings, and we're using spaces here, like in this case, and in this case right here, in order to give the correct spacing between the various words. All right, let's run the application, and we'll go and walk through it and talk about what it does. All right, so here we go. What is your first name? Type your first name. Here, Bob. Enter. What's your last name? Tabor. Enter. All right, now I unfortunately forgot something very important in my program. What did I forget? Whoops. I forgot the console.readLine. All right. So we can run it real quick again, and I also want to put one space here between the colon and that closing double quote so that it keeps it consistent between the first name and the last name. Let's run it again. All right, and here we go. What's your first name? Bob. Type your last name. Tabor. Hello, Bob Tabor. Very cool. All right, so great. First of all, let's talk about naming conventions. And convention is basically something that most programmers do, and they do it because it's not only a best practice, but because all the other programmers are doing it too, okay? And so it makes your code look consistent if you were to share your code with other people. So in this case, I named my variable my first name starting off with a lowercase m in my, then the capital F in first and capital N in name. And so this convention is called camel case. And you should get in the practice of using camel case whenever you name your variables, because again, most programmers do this, especially for variables that are declared inside of a given subroutine, function, or method. And we'll talk about the scope of variables in another lesson, but basically any variable that is of a local scope inside of a method, you should create them using this style of convention. You can name them anything you want. You should use long names and resist the urge to do what some books and some authors and articles that you might read online do, which is to use a convention like STR, first name. All right. The reason people do this is to remind themselves that this is a string. If your methods or functions are so long that you can't remember or you can't see their declaration in one page of code, then your methods are trying to do too much. But that's a whole other topic. Typically, you don't need to use that. It just muddies up the readability of your code. All right. So, and furthermore, if you were to hover your mouse cursor over a given variable, you can see pretty easily what the data type of that given variable is. In this case, my last name is declared as a string, as you can see there off to the right-hand side of the little bubble window that popped up underneath my mouse cursor. Okay, so the next thing that might have caught your attention is that we used WriteLine versus write here in lines 14 and 15. The only difference is that WriteLine will create a brand new line for the entire statement, whereas write will echo the characters that you have as input parameters, but it won't move automatically to the very next line. It'll just stay on that line. So that's what allowed us to say, type your first name. And then as we began typing, it came off to the right side of the colon that we had added right here. Okay. So here we have requested now the actual name of the user. And this is where we're using the console.readline in a slightly different way. We're retrieving whatever the user typed on the keyboard. And when they hit the enter key on the keyboard, at that point, the readline method will have executed and take whatever values were typed in by the end user and then assign them to this variable. So we've seen console.readline used without retrieving values like so, but it has this second function where it will actually retrieve back the values if we're interested in those values that the end user types in, and we are in this case. So we do basically the same thing here, nothing all that different until we get to line number 24, where we start appending values together into our WriteLine in order to display them nicely to the end user, to format that string nicely. Now there's two things that I want to point out about variables and about Visual Basic in general. First of all, Visual Basic is case insensitive. Now, other programming languages like C# will allow you to create two different variables that have the same name but with different casing. So you could create, for example, my first name all lowercase and then create a second variable called my first name all uppercase and then create my first name with uppercase, lowercase, uppercase, lowercase, and those would be three different variables. Okay, you can't do that in Visual Basic, fortunately. It makes it easy to step on yourself and to make mistakes if you're not careful when doing that in C#. So you can't do that in Visual Basic. That means if I were to do this, my dim first name as string, you'll see that I get a red squiggly line and it says the local variable my first name is already declared in the current code block. All right. Why? Well, even though the casing on the F and the N is different, it is essentially the same as this declaration here in line number 16. So that's the first thing about Visual Basic, is that it's case insensitive. Now, when you type, sometimes Visual Basic will try to capitalize words for you automatically. So I'm not going to use the shift key at all as I type this. So dim, and notice when I hit the space bar, it made it from a lowercase d to a capital D. My other value as, and I'm going to hit the space bar and it capitalized the word as, and I'll hit integer and I'll hit the space bar and it capitalized the I in integer. So Visual Studio will capitalize words for you, but essentially that's a function of Visual Studio, not a Visual Basic. Now you'll also notice inherently that while it is case insensitive, you cannot declare the same variable twice. So that's the second thing that we noticed here a moment ago. And that's why this would not work. My first name as string will give us an error because we've already declared my first name here, and case does not matter. So you cannot declare the same variable twice like you can in other programming languages. Okay. So now that we understand how to declare a variable, let's declare it and initialize its value in a single line of code. So here, I'm going to comment out this line of code right there. And I'm going to go to the next line. Dim my first name as string equals, double quotes, Bob. So when I use the term initialize, that means I'm going to set the value of a variable immediately at the point when I declare it. That's like creating the bucket and the value in the bucket all in one line of code. All right. So typically what you want to do is give your variables values as soon as possible. This puts your variable into what's known as a valid state, which will be an important idea as we learn about writing real applications as we get deeper into this series of lessons. But also experienced developers like to write less code, and they're always looking for a convenient way to reduce the number of keystrokes and just the sheer amount of code that they have to read through. And so, you know, something as simple as at some point it's going to become simple to create new variables and to initialize their value. Instead of doing that in 2 lines of code, it just makes sense to put them all in 1 line of code. So what I want to do is actually now, let's comment out this, because that doesn't really make a lot of sense in this application to go ahead and initialize the value the way that we did here. But what I will do here in this little block of code is to kind of do it all in one shot on these 2 lines. Lines 22 and 23, let's redo this like so. Dim my last name as string equals console.readline. All right. So now we're able to do both of these things, not only create a new variable, but also initialize its value to whatever the user types in on the read line. Okay. All right, so we talked about quite a bit in this lesson. We talked about what a variable is. We talked about declaring the variable, choosing the right data type based on the kind of data that we hope to store in memory. We talked about the difference between an integer and a string. So now we've got 2 data types to work with, right? Numeric values, especially ones that are between -2 billion and +2 billion that have no values after the decimal point, or a string of individual characters. We looked at using the equals sign as an assignment operator for assigning and retrieving values. We looked at the arithmetic operator. I didn't really talk about it, but basically we were just going to use the plus sign in order to add values together, just like we would do in any math problem. And we also looked at the ampersand, which is the code, the string concatenation character in order to append 2 strings together. We looked at the difference between console.write and console.writeLine. And we talked about naming conventions in camel case, and we looked at some of the rules of Visual Basic regarding naming, how Visual Basic is case insensitive, but it also will not allow us to create 2 variables with essentially the same name, but just with different casing. Okay, so we've added quite a bit more information under our belt about Visual Basic syntax. Let's continue the ball. We've got it rolling now. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you.